Hello! It's me again! Mr. Utzian's in the bathroom! Again! So I locked him in! Again! Oh, so today we're going to talk about Chapter 7 of Invisible Man. It's another really pretty good chapter. A lot of things going on in it. Pretty much transitional from south to north. But before we get started, I'm going to have a little help today from my wife, Henrietta. Henrietta, can you come in here, please? Isn't she gorgeous? Mwah! Love you, honey. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Chapter 7. Let's just do a real quick plot summary, shall we? Sure, why not? Did you read the chapter, honey? Excellent. Okay, so tell us what happens. That's right. Okay, so the narrator gets on the bus, leaving the college. But who's on the bus also? Surprise! It's the vet, that doctor from the Golden Day. And he's being taken to Washington, D.C. to another mental institution. Pretty coincidental. We'll talk about use of coincidence later when we talk about some style techniques that Allison uses. But for right now, it's important to know that he sits near the vet and they have a conversation, which we'll talk about in a little while also. And then they make it up to Harlem. So the whole chapter is really just this bus ride. Bus rides themselves, or journeys, are fairly redolent, fairly symbolic of transitions between one stage of life and another, and we see that going on here too. So let's talk about some of the things that are going on here. First, because it's 2019, we need to take a little bit of a look back at the historical context, which would have been more clear to the people back in the early 1950s who read this originally than it might be to us. So, let's talk about that. So, Henrietta, what can you tell us about the historical context? That's right! So, first, there were the Jim Crow laws. When the narrator gets on the bus, notice he has to go right to the back, even though the bus is nearly empty. The laws, as you probably know, required African Americans to sit in the back of the bus. Pretty creepy. In addition to that, when he gets north, he talks about he keeps on pages 158, 159, and 160, keeps mentioning these things about riots. Well, riots would have been a very familiar idea or concept to the people in the 1950s because there started to be race riots in places like Harlem. We get hints of that now. And you know that there's no point in mentioning riots early on if you're not going to have a riot, so look forward to that. Anything else, Henrietta? Oh yeah, I almost forgot. Thanks. And then, obviously, the contrast of life in the South and the North. We got a good glimpse of life in the South, and look how shocked the narrator is by seeing all the things that he sees in the North. Like, for example, black policemen and white policemen so confident in their power that they could even turn their backs on rabble-rousers who are trying to agitate. So, pretty interesting historical context for us to keep an eye on. But mostly, I think it's important to think about some of the stylistics going on in this chapter because they're really interesting. Want to talk about them, Henrietta? That's right! Okay, so first, notice how Allison's narrator is being explicitly literary, right? He talks about foreshadowing on page 151, and he talks about symbols on page 153. He also talked about on page 141, but we skipped over that, sorry. And then he uses the word surreal on page 146. So here you have the author himself, or the narrator, in the context, in the actual text of the novel, using some of these literary terms. And the significance of that is, it's an invitation, maybe even an obligation on the reader's part, to look for those literary techniques. Allison perhaps is a little self-conscious, a little worried that you might not see all the effort he's putting into these stylistics, and so he tells us, hey, don't forget to look for symbols, or foreshadowing, or interesting moods like surreal, so look for those too. Also, as you might have known, there are some allusions that he uses. On page 156, he talks about the best of all possible worlds. Do you know what that's an allusion to, Henrietta? That's it! Of course! It's an allusion to Candide! So, oh, wait a minute, you didn't read Candide. Or did you? I can't recall. Anyway, is an allusion to Candide. And then, as he's driving in the bus, he also sees a snake on the ground, which makes perfect sense because he's just been kicked out of Eden, so why wouldn't he see a snake there? And then finally, we get an allusion to the idea of Jonah and the whale, a story from the Bible. And the idea there is, as his grandfather told him, you be like a Jonah in the big body of the whale, or white society, and you're alive in it, and you can subvert it from within. And so we've seen that allusion before. We talked earlier when we were talking about the plot of this coincidence. So the use of coincidence is also something that's very stylistic. In the real world, it probably would not have happened that the narrator would have seen the very person who was so important in the previous chapter, the vet. He wouldn't have seen him on the same exact bus. But in literature, you have to remember, in fiction, the author doesn't just reflect the universe, he stylizes it, shapes the universe so that it more concisely fits his needs in order to make sure that the points he wants to make are understood. So he uses coincidence. He also noticed that not only are these two people brought together in such an unlikely fashion, but what else, Henrietta? Oh, that's right. Mwah! Love you. Notice how the two characters are in exact parallel situation. They've both been kicked out of their communities. So not just a coincidence of being brought together, but also a coincidence of the fact that they're in a very similar situation in their lives. In addition to coincidence, allusions, and being literary, we also see images being used again. We hear this notion of strings being pulled as if the narrator has been some sort of puppet being manipulated by a puppet master. So you find that image on page 154. And then there's the image on page 155 of the sun hanging over the campus of the college as he's leaving it. It's very poignant and sad. So these images that Allison makes are very, well, how can we say it? Yes, imagistic. So anyway, they're interesting portraits for you to think about, pictures that the author takes the time to write so that you can visualize what's going on. And then finally, a lot of use of motifs. Thank you so much, commentator, on the previous video. Some of the motifs we see here are the letters. Remember, now he's got 7 letters in his pocket, and it should remind us of the letters that he had in that dream in the briefcase that his grandfather had him open. And there is the briefcase too. We haven't seen that in a while, but that is going to travel with him from the south to the north. And then finally, we get another image when he's on the subway of being very close to this white woman and seeing a repulsive-looking mole on her face. And this motif of whites being very ugly when you see them close up, we saw that before when he had to be very close to Mr. Norton's face. Right? Of course you remember that. And then finally, what are we going to talk about, Henrietta? That's right, themes! All right, so the themes that we see in this chapter, once again, the power of speech. The vet talks about how the narrator mentions about the vet that he could destroy things just with his tongue. So speech being a very powerful force in people's lives. And we see that again in the next theme, which is becoming less naive and learning to deceive. We see him on pages 153 being invoked by the vet to break out of the fog that he's in, look around him, learn, see beneath the surface, become less naive. And then on 157, we see the narrator talking about all the techniques he's going to use when he's talking to all these important white people. And when you think about it, these are Bledsoe's techniques. All these kind of false fronts, this phoniness on the surface in order to get what he wants. This learning to deceive is another theme that we see being developed here. And then finally, this theme of the grandfather's advice, of being subversive. And here, not only does he remember his grandfather, and not only does the vet give him some of the exact same advice that his grandfather gave him, but we see this guy, this character Ross, R-A-S, who must be from Jamaica or someplace like that, and he speaks with that sort of accent. And he's the one up on a ladder, trying to get the crowd all agitated, back on pages 159. And so here you see this idea of subversion being developed again. And by subversion, yeah, I know it's a motif. The idea is that you should be subversive and not merely capitulate to the power structure, especially if it oppresses your individuality. Well, that's the chapter 7. I thought it was pretty good. What'd you think, Henrietta? Oh, thanks. Mwah. Well, next time we're going to read chapter 8. But I got to give you this kind of heads up. Chapter 8 is really short, but chapter 9 is not. So you might want to read ahead a little bit so that you don't have to read all of chapter 9 in one night, because that's a lot of work. Anyway, that's about it. Gotta go. Hey, Henrietta. Want to go dancing? Yay! See you later, everybody.